Sarah and Jason seemed like the perfect couple. Their love story one everyone envied. But behind the smiles and late-night walks, a darker side of Jason lurked, one that would eventually lead to the brutal murder of the woman he once claimed to adore. What started as a passionate romance quickly spiraled into a nightmare that no one saw coming. It was a love story that seemed destined for the ages. Sarah and Jason met during their first year of college, both studying at the same university. At first, their connection was casual, with little more than friendly chats over coffee. But it didn't take long for sparks to fly. Jason, a charming young man with an easy smile and a natural confidence, quickly captured Sarah's attention. Sarah, in contrast, was kind-hearted, introverted, and focused on her studies. But there was something about Jason's energy that drew her in. Their relationship blossomed quickly. By the end of their first semester, they were inseparable. They were the couple that everyone admired, always seen walking hand in hand across campus, sharing private jokes, and attending social events together. They seemed to balance each other perfectly. Jason was the outgoing extrovert, while Sarah was more reserved, and together they created a world where it seemed that nothing could tear them apart. Sarah's friends often envied her relationship, noting how supportive Jason was of her dreams, and how tender he could be when they spent time together. Jason was a rising star in his field, an ambitious young man who had already started his own small business, and Sarah was swept up in his drive. He encouraged her to pursue her passions, whether it was her career aspirations or her hobbies. To Sarah, he seemed like the perfect partner, a man who supported her ambitions while making her feel adored and special. Jason, on the other hand, admired Sarah's intelligence, her passion for life, and her beauty, both inside and out. He was often the one who insisted they go on spontaneous weekend trips or enjoy late-night walks under the stars. They would spend hours talking about everything and nothing, with the future always a shared dream between them. But as their relationship grew, so did Jason's attachment to Sarah. What initially felt like a deep connection between two souls started to feel heavier. At first it was small, almost imperceptible. Jason would make little comments when Sarah went out with friends, expressing mild concern for her safety, but he always framed it as concern for her well-being. Over time, however, these comments began to carry more weight. Jason became increasingly possessive. When Sarah didn't text him back immediately, he would ask, almost accusingly, who she was with and why she hadn't responded sooner. At first, Sarah brushed it off as harmless affection, interpreting his need to know as a sign of how much he cared for her. But there was something unsettling in the way Jason's eyes would narrow when he asked. Friends and family started to notice small changes in Sarah. She seemed more withdrawn, her social life outside of Jason becoming more limited. She stopped hanging out with her old group of friends, and instead, Jason became her world. While she still loved him deeply, a nagging feeling began to grow in the back of her mind. Something was off, though she couldn't quite pinpoint what it was. Every time Jason was upset about something, she felt as if it was her fault. His anger, while not violent, was intense, and it made her feel as though she was walking on eggshells. But love was blind, and Sarah convinced herself that it was just a phase, a passing moment. She didn't want to believe that the man she had fallen in love with was changing into someone else. It wasn't until later, when the damage was already done, that Sarah began to realize the depth of Jason's control over her life. But by then, it was too late. What had started as the perfect romance was slowly unraveling into something darker, a path Sarah would never have chosen for herself. The man who had once been her greatest supporter and closest friend had, in a matter of months, transformed into someone she barely recognized, though she would remain trapped in the illusion of love until the tragic end. The first signs of trouble were subtle, almost too small to notice at first. Sarah had always been the kind of person who trusted people, and she wanted to believe the best in Jason, even when things began to shift. It started with little things, almost as if Jason was just being protective or loving in a way that seemed normal to her at the time. He began to ask questions when she went out with friends, his voice laced with an underlying concern. But Sarah, eager to brush it off as harmless, didn't think much of it. One evening, after Sarah had spent a few hours at a friend's house, Jason asked her about a brief text conversation she'd had with her childhood friend, Mark. He wanted to know exactly what they'd talked about. At first, Sarah thought it was simply jealousy, a small flaw that everyone had. She reassured him that it was nothing, just a casual chat about old times. But Jason didn't seem convinced. He stared at her for what felt like an eternity, scrutinizing her words, his face tense. Sarah tried to laugh it off, but Jason wasn't amused. His eyes darkened, and he muttered something under his breath that Sarah couldn't quite make out. It made her uncomfortable, but she quickly told herself it was just an off moment. She convinced herself that Jason was just being protective because he cared so much for her. As weeks went by, these moments became more frequent, more intense. Jason would call her several times when she was out, asking her where she was, who she was with, and why she hadn't answered his earlier calls. Sarah began to feel like she was constantly apologizing, even though she had done nothing wrong. Jason started to make it clear that he didn't like her spending time with other people, especially men. At first, he would try to mask his discomfort with a smile, but there was always an edge to his voice, a slight tension in his posture that she couldn't ignore. The more she spent time with Jason, the less she saw of her friends. He would make subtle comments about how her friends didn't have her best interests at heart, planting seeds of doubt in her mind about the people who had been there for her long before Jason came into the picture. He would suggest that maybe Sarah didn't need to go out with them, that they weren't as important as the relationship they shared. These comments were never overtly harsh, but they carried an undeniable weight, enough to make Sarah question her choices. Jason's need to control grew more apparent. He would insist on knowing where Sarah was going, who she was meeting, and how long she would be there. If she didn't comply with his demands, he would sulk, a silent treatment that seemed to stretch on for hours. His coldness hurt Sarah more than anything else, so she would quickly give in, agreeing to let him know her whereabouts at all times. She thought this was just part of being in a relationship, especially one as serious as theirs. But with each passing day, it became harder to ignore the growing sense that her independence was slipping away, piece by piece. Soon, the calls and messages turned into something more invasive. Jason began checking her phone when she wasn't, looking, scrolling through her texts and social media accounts. At first, Sarah caught him once or twice, but Jason would laugh it off, claiming he was just trying to make sure everything was okay. He'd brush off her concerns with a smile, convincing her that there was nothing to worry about. But Sarah felt the walls closing in around her, unsure of how to escape this tightening grip that Jason had on her life. By the time Sarah realized that Jason's behavior was no longer just about love or concern, it was too late. Her friends noticed the changes in her, how she seemed more withdrawn, less enthusiastic about plans they made, and how often she canceled last minute to spend time with Jason. But Sarah didn't see it. She didn't see that her world had shrunk to just one person. and that person's demands were growing increasingly unreasonable. What had once been a whirlwind romance, full of passion and excitement, had turned into a prison she couldn't escape. She was trapped, believing that if she just loved Jason enough, everything would go back to the way it had been before, when life was simple and carefree. But the truth was that things would never be the same again. Jason's possessiveness was now undeniable, and Sarah was beginning to feel the weight of it every day. But the fear of confronting him, of standing up for herself, was paralyzing. She couldn't shake the feeling that if she did, the love they once shared would vanish, and so would Jason. Little did she know, the worst was yet to come. The night that changed everything began like any other, or at least that's how Sarah tried to convince herself. It was a Friday evening, and Sarah had planned to make a quiet dinner for herself and Jason. She had always enjoyed these small, intimate moments, just the two of them. The apartment was dimly lit with candles, and she had cooked Jason's favorite meal, hoping it would lift his spirits. Recently, he had been quieter than usual, more distant, but she hoped the evening would help him relax. Jason arrived late, as he often did, with an excuse about work. Sarah greeted him with a warm smile, but something in his eyes caught her off guard. They were no longer the loving, attentive eyes she had fallen in love with. Instead, there was a flicker of frustration in them, barely concealed beneath the surface. Jason kissed her lightly on the cheek, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. She had learned to notice these small differences, and they made her uneasy. Dinner started out fine, with Jason complimenting the meal and Sarah feeling a sense of relief that, at least for a while, everything seemed normal. But as the night wore on, Sarah began to sense that something was off. Jason had been distracted, his eyes drifting toward his phone every few minutes. When he put it down, he was still absent, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. His gaze kept shifting back to her, but it wasn't the affectionate look she was used to. It was colder, sharper. They had always enjoyed deep conversations, talking for hours about anything and everything, but tonight there was a tension in the air, an unspoken worry that Sarah couldn't shake. Jason finally broke the silence, but his tone was different from usual. He began asking her questions about her day, more questions than usual. He was probing, his voice edging toward an accusation rather than curiosity. He asked where she had been, who she had been with, and what she had done. Sarah, feeling confused but trying to brush it off, answered as best as she could, but Jason seemed to be growing increasingly agitated with every answer. Then came the moment that shook her to her core. Jason's phone buzzed, and Sarah saw the name on the screen. Mark. It was a name she knew well, an old friend from college. Jason's face darkened as he stared at the message for a moment too long. He looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, his jaw clenched tightly. "I saw you were texting him earlier today," Jason said, his voice low and controlled, but there was an edge to it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was referring to. She had sent Mark a simple, "Hey, hope you're doing well," message earlier that morning, nothing out of the ordinary. She tried to explain that it was just a friendly check-in, but Jason's face twisted in a way she had never seen before. His eyes were no longer the calm, affectionate ones she had fallen for. They were filled with something darker, something Sarah couldn't identify, and it terrified her. His next words were sharp, venomous. "You think I'm stupid, don't you? I've been watching you." His voice rose, and Sarah instinctively pulled back, her chest tightening in fear. She hadn't seen Jason angry like this in months. He was usually the calm one, the one who kept things in check. But tonight, something in him had snapped. Sarah tried to calm him down, but the more she spoke, the angrier Jason became. The words he used were not like him. "You think I don't know what's going on?" he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "I see the way you look at him. Don't lie to me, Sarah. You've been hiding things. You think I don't know what's going on behind my back?" The dinner she had prepared with so much care lay forgotten on the table, growing cold as the confrontation escalated. Sarah felt like she was suffocating. Jason's anger wasn't like the small bursts of irritation he had shown before. This was something darker, more dangerous. His face was inches from hers now, his breath ragged, and she could feel the heat of his rage. Desperately, she tried to back away, but Jason's hand shot out, gripping her wrist tightly. His fingers dug into her skin, and she gasped in pain. "You don't get to walk away from me," he hissed. Fear rushed through Sarah. The man she loved, the man she had built her life around, was no longer the same person. She struggled to free herself from his grasp, but he tightened his hold. She couldn't understand what had happened to him, what had driven him to this point. Her heart pounded in her chest, and all she wanted was to escape. In that moment, Sarah realized how far she had fallen. The man who had once promised to love her had turned into someone she didn't recognize, and worse, someone who was capable of violence. She fought with every ounce of strength she had, but the fear of what Jason might do next gripped her heart, and she knew she was no longer in control of her own fate. The evening had gone from what was supposed to be a quiet night of connection to a nightmare she couldn't escape. And the worst part? She had no idea that this was only the beginning. The morning after the violent confrontation, Sarah's phone remained silent. Her friends had grown used to hearing from her by now. She was the type of person who checked in regularly, even if it was just a quick text. But that morning, there was nothing. At first, they thought maybe she had decided to spend the entire day with Jason, retreating into their world. But as the hours passed, they began to worry. When no messages or calls came through by late afternoon, her best friend, Emily, decided to check in. She called Sarah several times, but the phone went straight to voicemail. With each passing hour, the worry began to escalate. Emily tried texting, asking if everything was okay, but still, there was no response. Sarah wasn't the type to ignore people, especially not Emily, who had been her confidant for years. The concern turned into genuine fear. Emily knew that something wasn't right. She tried reaching Jason, thinking that perhaps he could shed some light on where Sarah had gone. When Jason answered, his voice was unusually calm, too calm. He told her that Sarah was just fine, that she had been feeling tired and was probably still asleep. Emily, skeptical but still somewhat reassured, thanked him and hung up. But something didn't sit right. Jason's tone had been almost too controlled, as if he were trying too hard to convince her that everything was normal. By the evening, Emily's anxiety had reached its peak. With no further word from Sarah, she contacted the police. They arrived at the apartment, and Jason met them at the door with a forced smile. He claimed everything was fine, that Sarah had simply gone to bed early, needing some rest after a stressful week. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of panic that Emily had missed earlier. The officers pushed him gently aside, demanding to search the apartment. Jason hesitated, but reluctantly allowed them to enter. As the officers walked through the door, the air in the apartment felt different, still and heavy, as though something terrible had happened. But the room was silent. Then they found her. Sarah's lifeless body was discovered in the bedroom, a sight that would haunt everyone who came across it. The room was in disarray, her clothes torn, and bruises marked her skin, evidence of the brutal assault she had endured. The struggle had been fierce. Sarah had fought with everything she had. But the most chilling part was the way she had been, left behind, as if the violence had been a statement, an act of dominance that no one could deny. Her hands were bloodied from trying to defend herself, and there was a look in her eyes, frozen in terror, that would never leave anyone who saw it. The officers immediately arrested Jason, his calm demeanor completely unraveling when they confirmed that Sarah had been murdered. He was taken into custody, and the truth of what had transpired behind closed doors began to surface. Jason had tried to appear nonchalant, but the cracks in his facade grew wider as the police questioned him further. His stories didn't match up. The timeline was off. The lies started to unravel, and it became clear that the violence Sarah had feared the night before had escalated to something far worse. As the investigation proceeded, the detectives discovered that Jason had been controlling Sarah for months, using subtle manipulation to keep her isolated and dependent on him. Her friends had suspected something was wrong, but none of them had been able to pierce through the layers of charm and warmth that Jason had carefully crafted. Sarah, in her love for him, had been blind to the growing danger. She had trusted him, even as he tightened his grip on her every move. The horror of what had occurred hit hard for Sarah's friends and family. Emily, who had known Sarah longer than anyone, couldn't fathom how this had happened. How could the man she had trusted, the man they all thought was so loving, turn into a monster? What had made Jason capable of such brutality? The answers, they would soon learn, were buried deep in Jason's psyche. A man whose obsession had consumed him, whose jealousy had twisted his perception of love into something dark and dangerous. As the police uncovered more details of Jason's past, it became clear that he had a history of violent outbursts, that his charming personality had always been a mask to hide his rage. The perfect relationship had been a lie, and now the truth, as painful as it was, had to be confronted. As they processed the scene, one thing became painfully clear. Sarah had fought until the very end, refusing to give in. But in the end, Jason's brutality had won. What had once been a love story filled with promise had turned into one of the most chilling murders the town had ever seen. As the investigation into Sarah's death unfolded, the truth about Jason's life began to unravel in a way no one had expected. For months, Sarah's friends and family had believed that Jason was the perfect partner, charismatic, attentive, and supportive. But as the evidence piled up, it became clear that Jason had been hiding a dark and violent side that no one had seen, not even Sarah. The more the police dug into his past, the more they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior, a series of violent outbursts with past girlfriends, and a history of manipulation and control. Jason's past was filled with warning signs, but they had all been overlooked or dismissed as misunderstandings. He had always been charming, able to weave a web of lies that made him appear harmless to anyone who wasn't close enough to see the cracks. But those closest to him, Sarah, his family, and friends, had no idea just how dangerous he truly was. He had been able to hide his temper behind a carefully constructed image of a loving boyfriend, someone who was always there for Sarah, someone who supported her dreams and ambitions. In reality, He had been slowly isolating her from the people who cared about her most, convincing her that she didn't need anyone but him. The police found records of previous arguments and violent incidents, some of which had been dismissed as lovers' quarrels by Jason's former partners. The pattern was unmistakable. He had manipulated and controlled them in the same way he had done with Sarah, always using his charm to reel them in before revealing his true nature. But for Sarah, the manipulation had been more insidious. Jason had convinced her that his possessiveness was a sign of how much he cared for her, how deeply he loved her. She had believed it, just as his previous girlfriends had. But it was never love. It was control, pure and simple. As the trial approached, the weight of Jason's actions settled heavily on everyone who had known Sarah. Her family was devastated, unable to comprehend how someone who had seemed so perfect could be capable of such horror. They had trusted him, welcomed him into their lives, and now they had to come to terms with the fact that he had taken away their daughter, their sister, their friend, in the most brutal way imaginable. Her friends, too, were shaken to their core. They had all seen the warning signs, the way Sarah had become more withdrawn, the way Jason would constantly check in on her, the way she started to cancel plans with them to spend time with him. But no one had realized how deep the control had gone, how much Sarah had been manipulated into believing she was nothing without him. When Jason finally took the stand, his demeanor was chilling. He claimed that he had been acting out of love, that he had never intended for things to escalate the way they did. He tried to paint